Thank you. It's great to be here. I thought that both because history can and should represent an effort to report things that really happened, but also because each of us sees in history what our background leads us to see. I think I should begin with a little background on how I came to be discussing the topic of Jewish philanthropy in Cleveland. In the 1940s and 50s in Portland, Oregon, and in high school I was quite active in the Presbyterian Church youth program. I first encountered Cleveland and its Jewish community in a spring vacation visit to the family of a college classmate, David Lelyveld, whose father was, of course, rabbi at Fairmont Temple. My wife is Jewish. Her mother left Pinsk in the late 1930s, and my oldest grandson will have his bar mitzvah in New York this coming May. I can date my interest in nonprofit organizations and philanthropy to my Columbia University PhD dissertation and first book on power and society in Greater New York, and to at the beginning of the 20th century, and to questions raised by my dissertation advisor Sigmund Diamond, who was a leader in the application of social science to history, but before that had been a labor organizer in Detroit during the 1930s. He had some distinctive memories of Cleveland himself. My interest in philanthropy really developed through my extensive involvement with the Mandel Center for Nonprofit Organizations at CWRU, which led in turn to my leadership of an extended Aspen Institute-funded project that has yielded 3 books on the contributions of American foundations. So maybe that gives you some sense of why I think I can talk about this, but I'm delighted that there's a group of this size. My guess is on this topic that there are lots of views, and that anything I say will provoke dissent and alternative perspectives, and I look forward to learning as a result. I'd start by saying that the topic, history of Jewish philanthropy, is an undefinable and unresearchable topic. What is Jewish philanthropy? That's a big question in itself. The Torah puts emphasis on giving to support the temple and its priests. That dimension of philanthropy is often neglected, but it's actually fundamental in Christianity and in other religions as well. And American law has always treated gifts for the advancement of religion as charitable for tax purposes. If we focus on giving to specifically Jewish institutions and causes, we have to consider the full range of Jewish religious and communal activity. And then we would, if we only focused on that, we would miss both the relationship between Jewish religious and communal activity on the one hand and the larger society on the other, as well as the important roles that Jewish and Jewish donors have played in the community at large. If we focus on giving to the needy, which is another injunction, religious injunction, then we have to include both immediate provision of food, clothing, and shelter, and aid to the sick, and care for prisoners and captives, and support for widows and orphans, and the frail elderly, and aid to those who have suffered from disasters and conflicts. But we must also consider efforts to increase general prosperity and to assure full employment and universal access to health care, and efforts to eliminate all forms of discrimination and subordination. The topic gets bigger and bigger and less manageable. If we limit our attention to the needy, we'd fail to note giving designed to achieve many other purposes that American law and practice define as charitable. And efforts to support religious activity, community concerns of many groups, civic advocacy, education, literary activity, science, the arts, and to quote some, and I'm quoting here phrases from the IRS web pages on tax exemption. They also include the phrase erecting public buildings, monuments, or works, lessening neighborhood tensions, eliminating prejudice and discrimination, and defending human and civil rights secured by law. I guess if the rights aren't secured by law, it's not a charity to support them. Giving to the art to support the arts is not in itself defined as charitable in American law, but American arts organizations qualify for charitable legal status by emphasizing their educational activities. If we define philanthropy as making very big gifts, as sometimes is practiced, we reduce our history to a celebration of the generous among the wealthy. That's an important work, but it's a narrow one. Cleveland's Jewish community, of course, has produced a remarkable list of very wealthy donors, but many other people who've contributed in many philanthropic ways to a wide variety of purposes. A historian has to add that there's no source single source. In fact, ultimately, it's hard to find any source for much of the required information. Anonymous is an important contributor to every fundraising campaign. Under American law, religious institutions are not asked to report gifts. Some institutions celebrate some donations, but often they do so in limited ways. The Indiana University Lilly School of Philanthropy, which has just recently been created, has been doing its best to track million-dollar gifts, but it has been doing that only for a few years, and the lists are far from complete. And comparing the value of a gift from one time period to another is much more difficult than we might think. According to the excellent website Measuring Worth, a $1 million donation in 1950 might be the equivalent today of an amount ranging from $8 million to $60 million, depending on whether the comparison is to pay for a market basket of consumer goods, or for the cost of a complex building, or the salaries of highly educated professionals, for instance, doing medical research. Given all these challenges, we can't consider everything, so I want to focus on institutions, and I also want to focus on the past, at least some distance in the past. Many members of Cleveland's Jewish community have engaged in extraordinary philanthropy in recent decades. That work continues and is already, no doubt, attracting its own historians, and there'll be much more in due course. I'd start from a perspective suggested that I take from a famous statement of Maimonides, which, if I paraphrase correctly, holds that the highest level of charitable giving is attained when a donor provides support through a gift or loan or access to employment in such a way that neither the donor nor the beneficiary knows the identity of the other, and so that the beneficiary does not lose self-respect or become dependent. What is striking about this statement is that it, to me, in this context, is that it assumes the existence of an institution through which the gift can move to the beneficiary. The classic examples are scholarship funds and revolving loan funds. A student who gets a scholarship has a sense that he or she has earned the support, and the money goes to advance the student's education and hence capacity for self-support and for contributing to the larger community. A person who gets a loan has won the loan committee's confidence that he or she can complete a project and repay the loan. These thoughts suggest we can organize our thinking about Jewish philanthropy in terms of its relation to institutions that channel the flow of contribution. In the end, I want to argue this evening that Jewish philanthropy in Cleveland is particularly notable for its contributions to some key aspects of fundamental American institutions. I particularly emphasize the growth of nationally connected secular and non-sectarian institutions in health, higher education, and many other fields, and the emphasis on mutual respect and cooperation among religious and other communities within the United States. One place to begin, I don't think I can start a discussion of Jewish philanthropy without noting that the considerable contributions of Jewish giving to Jewish institutions in Northeast Ohio. And this is another topic that's endless, but I think it's important just to note the many institutions that have been supported through the construction of facilities, through the education of staffs, through the creation of endowments for congregations, for orphanages, for community centers, clinics, hospitals, associations to aid the poor with job training, homes for the elderly, and many other services. Some of the early funds for these purposes came not just from donors in Cleveland, but from other cities. New Orleans merchant Judah Turo, for example, left bequests for many institutions in the U.S. in 1854. The $3,000 he left the congregation Tefereth Israel, which helped build a building, was the equivalent today of something like $1 million. There are other examples, including the 1882 action of the order Kesher Shel Barzel that launched the home for the Jewish elderly that involved in Montefiore. A stream of initiatives that started with the Young Ladies Hebrew Association in 1892 led to the creation of a free clinic on East 55th Street, and then in 1927 to Mount Sinai Hospital. Between the 20s and the 1990s, Cleveland's Jewish community, no doubt also with some help from outside, built in Mount Sinai, one of the nation's leading centers of scientific medicine. The work that predated the 1894 formation of the National Council of Jewish Women Cleveland section and its creation of the Council Educational Alliance is another example. That, of course, was a forerunner of the Jewish Community Center, which has a very extended history through the whole 20th century and down till today. Gifts also went from Cleveland to Jewish institutions elsewhere. Cleveland Reformed congregations had close ties to Hebrew Union Seminary in Cincinnati, for example, from the earliest days. And as Cleveland's Jewish community grew to include significant numbers of Orthodox, giving broadened to underwrite a wider and wider range of Jewish denominations, to use that term, and to support distinctive services and institutions to provide special services to various segments of the Jewish community. You might mention the 1884 origins of a Talmud Torah that evolved into the Cleveland Hebrew Schools, the 1906 start of Menorah Park Center for the Aging, and many other initiatives. I'd end with a particularly famous 19th century example, the decision of B'nai B'rith Midwest District to promote the creation of a Jewish orphan asylum in Cleveland to serve the families of Jewish communities west of the Appalachians, southern as well as northern. Historian Gary Polster has written a very good study of the first several decades of the orphan asylum, which evolved into Belfair. What I would emphasize, and I've really learned about the context for this just recently in reading more about Southern religious history in the United States, the orphan asylum reflects joint support, joint cooperation between Jewish communities in the South as well as in the North in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. At that time, Southern Protestants absolutely refused offers of assistance from their northern colleagues, particularly Northern Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, who wished to reach out and help reconstruct their denominational facilities in the South after the destruction of the war. We're still dealing today with the consequences of these harsh North-South divisions within Protestant communities. It's one of the things I think that's really in the background of today's political situation. Real institutional splits and a lack of communication across state lines and across regional lines. The Jewish community refused to be drawn into that, and that I think is quite makes the Cleveland Orphan Asylum quite a notable institution. It's still difficult to pursue effective conversations within religious communities, and not only within religious communities, but also within educational institutions, to have north-south discussions that are really serious and honest about educational standards and educational content. And I think all of that really has to do with the division. Andrew Carnegie made an effort to try to repair that at the time of World War I by setting up the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association to provide retirement pensions for college professors. The idea was that there was no general system at the time of pensions. What was available was most college professors at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th had been trained in theological schools or divinity schools. Most of them also were ministers. They could get a pension if they kept themselves in good standing with the denomination that they'd been affiliated with. But there was no non-sectarian source of pensions for college professors. That aspect is usually omitted from the story, but that's really critical to what Carnegie was doing in funding the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association, which is now, of course, one of the enormous financial institutions. When he made the offer, he said, since there are these religious funds, any school that remains part of a religious community and is controlled by it has to look elsewhere for pensions for its faculty. None of the Southern Protestant-affiliated colleges was willing to break their connection with their religious communities in the Southern Baptist Church, the Southern Methodist, or the Southern Presbyterians. And so they stayed out of the Carnegie pensions, and that continued until probably 20 years ago. I haven't looked to the later history, but for a very long time, that was a whole separate world. And I think that, so I think we can ignore that, but I think if we do, we're not paying real attention to the major institutional structures in the United States. So we can look at Jewish institutions, and we can look at the way they parallel or differ from comparable institutions in other communities. We can also, another topic that would be a whole nother consideration is Jewish giving for concerns outside the United States. And Cleveland donors have clearly been involved with those concerns from the time of pogroms in Russia in the 1880s through Zionist efforts in Palestine in the 1920s, engagement with all the catastrophes of the 30s and 40s, both in seeking to rescue people and get them out of dangerous parts of Europe and to deal with the consequences of the Holocaust. A very good dissertation that I advised at Case Western Reserve by Sylvia Abrams, who's been much involved with Jewish education here, dealt with, in part, Cleveland engagement with the consequences of World War II and the Holocaust. Clearly, Clevelanders have been much involved, deeply involved with the creation of Israel and with institutions in Israel. And each of these is an enormous story with many complexities attached to it. And could go on to many other more recent events that I'm sure all of you are well aware of. Let me emphasize two large themes that have to do with Cleveland Jewish contributions and philanthropy that have particularly involved with opening opportunity both for Jews and for others, and have had to do with the reshaping of relationships among philanthropic and religious institutions of all communities in the United States. So first, the opening of opportunity. Charles Liebman of the New York Federation of Jewish Philanthropies argued in a very interesting article in 1979 that a key aim of American Jewish philanthropy for 70 years or more up to that time had been, and this is his language, to raise the standing of the Jewish community and improve acceptance of Jewish professionals by funding excellence and making excellent health care and other services, including access to arts education and arts experiences, available to everyone. Liebman sees that focus of Jewish philanthropy as of high importance from the early 20th century. In his view, then, Jews had important motives both for giving to Jewish institutions such as Mount Sinai Hospital and for not to non-Jewish institutions as well. Notable Jewish donors, including the Guggenheims and others in New York, Julius Rosenwald in Chicago, and the Beaumont Foundation in Cleveland, provided important support for non-sectarian higher education and healthcare, working closely for such purposes with such prominent Gentile donors as Rockefeller and Carnegie. Jewish giving for such purposes seems to have received little publicity in the community before the 1940s. Bob Grease quotes his grandfather, Nathan Dowby, as writing that he had always avoided publicity in this kind of philanthropy, and added, "If I have made any contribution to the welfare of Cleveland, of the community of Cleveland, I would prefer not to have it publicized." He added, "It would take away the pleasure of doing things if I could not continue to do them behind the scenes." But other wealthy Jewish donors did not share that view. Rosenwald and the Guggenheims, for example, gave ambitiously and very publicly through foundations created in their own names. Rosenwald's insistence that donors should give to current causes rather than establish permanent foundations certainly influenced Dobby and his uncle Louis Beaumont when he established the Beaumont Foundation in 1942, specifying that it must spend out all of its assets within 35 years. And Dobby followed suit in his own sunsetting foundation in 1944. For many years, the Beaumont Foundation was one of the three largest foundations in Northeast Ohio. The name is was on some important buildings at Case Western Reserve when I came here, and buildings that aren't there anymore. So it was given for the current purpose. The next generation would have to look after its own needs. Cleveland Jewish Philanthropy was also much involved with campaigns against discrimination and and the intergroup relations movement. There's a bookshelf of studies exploring these matters, and many of them have extended discussions of Cleveland contributions. I mentioned just Stuart Svonkin's Jews Against Prejudice, Mark Doninger's Quest for Inclusion, and Alan Middleman's Religion as a Public Good, and Murray Friedman's What Went Wrong? The Creation and Collapse of the Black-Jewish Alliance. I think the names of the books are worth reading for the stories they imply, and we can talk about some of those topics if you like. The last topic I want to raise has to do with Jewish giving that had the effect of shaping general institutions in Northeast Ohio and the U.S. In the case of science, medicine, non-sectarian universities, the Cleveland contributions, I think, were supplementing and joining those that had perhaps leadership elsewhere. In this last area, there are some things that I think are specific to Cleveland, where Cleveland Jewish philanthropy really has played a nationally leading role, and that's at least a thought I want to put out, and I'd be glad to be corrected on it or have it further illustrated. Through the 19th century and into the 20th century, America's most prominent institutions in education and health, but also in social welfare and in the arts to a lesser extent, but still significantly, the most prominent institutions were closely associated with Protestant denominations. To the extent that their aims were to advance the religion of their sponsors, these institutions found it natural to emphasize religious affiliation in assembling boards, engaging staffs, designing programs, and making pensions available. But to the extent that they aimed to serve the nation as a whole, narrow denominational commitments proved a serious liability. Not only did Presbyterian organizations shut themselves off from fruitful engagement with Catholics and Jews, they also found themselves at odds on occasion with the great majority of fellow Protestants who adhered to other denominations. After the Civil War, the leading northern institutions inspired increasingly to national service, but they were discouraged from engaging in any serious cooperation with southern institutions within the same communities. And so they had a real challenge. How could they provide national leadership? In Science, Jews, and the Secular Culture, the title of a recent book, the distinguished historian David Hollinger asks whether Jews found their way into prominence in the academy and the professions because of a prior de-Christianization well advanced among intellectuals of Anglo-Protestant origin, or because these Jews themselves had helped by their very presence and by their pressure against the old exclusionary system to de-Christianize the space they were gradually entering. His answer is that the two sources of change work together. The Cleveland story, it seems to me, is a little different. As I tried to suggest at the outset, it has particularly to do with encouraging mutual respect and cooperation among religious and other communities within the United States. Cooperation between Protestants, Catholics, and Jews rather than simply promoting secularization. From the 1890s, Jews also played key roles in inventing in Cleveland important initiatives for interfaith collaboration, including the invention of the Community Chest, later the United Way, and the Community Foundation. The key event was the appointment of Martin Marks, a member of the Jewish community, to lead the Committee on Benevolent Institutions of the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce in about 1900, an effort of the Chamber of Commerce to resolve Catholic distress with Protestant proselytizing through social welfare and healthcare and educational institutions. Because he was neither Protestant nor Catholic, Marx could play a mediating role and was selected to do that by the larger community. The result was to separate the Protestant denominational structures from control over most social service organizations that sought to engage the entire community, and to associate social service organizations whose organizations had been Protestant with others whose origins were Catholic and Jewish, under the general supervision of a Federation for Community Planning. And to make the new institutional arrangement work, the Community Chest was created with strong Chamber of Commerce support to engage in very substantial annual fundraising. That's become United Way, and United Way now is having to redefine its role. If you only know the current situation, you might be surprised to learn that in 1930, the Community Chest raised 40% of the income of hospitals in Cleveland. And much larger share of the income of social service organizations, and played a role. Private giving played a significant role in education as well. In all these areas, the share of the cost of the services that's borne by private giving has declined very sharply. So this was a big thing when it was worked on starting in 1900. It really yielded fruit only in 1914, just as World War I was beginning, and was given a big impetus by the War Chest effort to raise money for Red Cross and other activities of that kind during World War I, and then really took off after in 1918 and in the 1920s. Protestant groups at the same time set up a separate council of churches to manage their common concerns and their relations with one another, in a sense taking a leaf from the book of the Jewish federations, which had already been created. Catholic charities in Cleveland emerged at the time to fill out the pattern. To raise endowed funds for projects important to all, the Cleveland Foundation was established at the same time under a charter that excluded it from holding funds for religious purposes. I discovered this fact just shortly after I came to Case Western Reserve, when Steve Minter asked me to look into the history of community foundations. And he'd always wondered why the Cleveland Foundation didn't have religious funds. Well, it really is because it came out of this effort to deal with religious conflict and tensions at the beginning of the time when the Cleveland Foundation was created. Much of what I've just said here was developed by my student Brian Ross, whose dissertation makes it clear that that Martin Marks was central to these developments. If events prevented Marx from getting to a meeting of the Committee on Benevolent Organizations. The meeting was rescheduled. Another way of putting this is that Cleveland Jews played national parts in creating the Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and religious non-sectarian divisions that organize so much of U.S. civil society, structuring the entities that provide most support for families and much job training, healthcare, and education. And let me add here that it's one thing to start these kinds of divisions, as was done in 1918, but it's another thing to make them work over time. Many Cleveland foundations made annual contributions, for example, to the community chest right through the 20s, and especially in the 30s and 40s, when the Depression made it much more difficult to raise significant amounts of money through an annual campaign. In fact, Herbert Hoover asked a Clevelander to lead the national effort to respond to the Depression in 1931 with a community chest campaign. That effort was absolutely failed, and the community chest would have entirely collapsed, I think, if it hadn't been sustained by foundation giving through the 30s and 40s. The Jewish contribution in this case was helping to define the pattern of faith community-based and nonprofit organizations, helping Protestants find ways to separate religious activity from their leading colleges, universities and hospitals, and community-level social service activities, but also helping Catholics in the 1920s win the Pierce versus Society of Sisters case, in which a Ku Klux Klan originated law passed in the state of Oregon said that all children had to go to public schools through the 8th grade. That would have made Catholic parochial schools illegal, and a Supreme Court decision invalidated that law in the 1920s. Another piece of this larger story. There's much more we could consider under these headings. And so I'll just mention a couple of other items and then see if this provokes any corrections. Arguably, Jews made important contributions in Cleveland to creating high-quality public elementary and secondary schools and public libraries, not in Cleveland as well as in the U.S. And Cleveland, as some of you may remember, was notable for the high quality of its public schools into the 1950s. While it's true that the initial impulse for public schools came from Protestants, and that Protestants in many places exerted considerable influence on public schools, in places where Jews were numerous, I think it can be argued that Jews supported non-sectarian public schools by sending their children to them, by voting in favor of school taxes, by providing them with disproportionate share of good teachers. And we've been learning, as people have really looked into the history of schools, like the notable early high schools in Philadelphia and in a number of other places, that public secondary schools in particular in the 20s and 30s often benefited from private gifts of substantial size to help make the buildings more impressive, to provide them with libraries and laboratories and other facilities that were not universally available in American public schools, even in the 1950s. So there was a good deal of private philanthropy that went into public schools, not only in state colleges, but also in secondary schools. I think in another dimension, it's worth mentioning leadership, the political leadership, but also the leadership in inter-community cooperation and collaboration from some notable Cleveland members of Cleveland's Jewish community, whose names may not be as immediately familiar as some others. For the first 20 or so years of the 20th century, the chairman of the Cuyahoga County Republican Committee was Maurice Maschke, and he had, for example, a hand in leading the Cleveland City Council to oppose the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the distribution of Henry Ford's anti-Semitic newspaper in the 1920s. And another prominent Jewish leader in Cleveland public life was Arnold Benish, a key member of the Cleveland Board of Education, and to some extent at least a champion, among other things, of opportunities for African American teachers. Well, there was also considerable support in the Jewish Federation and in the Jewish community for the movements against discrimination in employment, the Fair Employment Practice Commission, and in Cleveland, which is both a government agency but needed, obviously, community support to be effective. Could go a little bit more broadly to the impact of having a large Jewish community in Cleveland, but I think it's fair to add this as a contribution to shaping philanthropy of the community as a whole. More than one Jewish immigrant at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century criticized Cleveland's appearance at that time as inferior even to the provincial towns in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, let alone to, inferior to Bratislava or towns in outside Budapest, let alone to Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and Krakow. By the time of World War I, Frederick C. Howe would report that he and Morris Black, a grandson of Jewish immigrants from Hungary, had used illustrated stories of the groupings of public buildings in Vienna, Paris, Budapest, Dresden, and Munich to persuade the Cleveland Chamber of Commerce to back the plan to raise impressive public buildings around the mall in downtown Cleveland. And my guess is that that had something to do with Severance's decision to build Severance Hall, which has recently been used as a backdrop set for movies that are supposed to be set in a Hungarian castle. Perhaps no more in Cleveland than everywhere, Cleveland Jews also supported B'nai B'rith, the ACLU, the NAACP, and other efforts to reduce religious, ethnic, and racial discrimination. But there's much more to that story than I've mentioned here. I'm just beginning to learn a bit about it. But let me end with a mention of Edith Ansfield Wolf's endowment of the Anisfield Wolf Book Awards, which is really an extraordinary story. If you now go on their website and look at the publications that have won that prize, started in the mid-1930s, and many of the most notable works about every minority group, about religious groups, about efforts to deal with religious and other kinds of conflict, has won an Anisfield Wolf Award, and the quality is very high all the way through. Until the 1960s, the award was managed by the Saturday Review of Literature, and since then by the Cleveland Foundation, and of course Henry Louis Gates has been chairing the committee for the last dozen years, if my memory is correct. So there's that's perhaps a good note to end as kind of an emblem of what I think of as Jewish philanthropy in Cleveland. So thank you. Yes.
You talk a little bit about the creation of Jewish Federation around the turn of the 20th century and how some of the people, Martin Marx, went on to have a role in the general community, in the community trust. Was Cleveland unique in that sense in having a Jew during that time so involved in the general community in that way?
Both the community chest and the community foundation started in Cleveland, and I think I've asked why that's the case, and part of what was essential to both of them was the non-sectarian nature of it. It's interesting, at that time in New York, there was a large Jewish community. There was an institutionalized conflict between Catholics and Protestants. In the 1890s, New York adopted a new constitution that included what Catholics called the Blaine Amendment, which was that no state money would go to Catholic schools. But there was a deal, and in fact there was a Jewish leader of the Republican Party in Manhattan County, in New York County, Manhattan, in New York, who was involved in that deal, and the deal was that social service organizations would continue to get government money, but not educational institutions. So it's in New York as well as in Cleveland, there were Jewish leaders in these things. I think the Jewish leaders were more central, and the agreements were more comprehensive in Cleveland. And New York had struggled to develop anything like a significant a community foundation or a community chest as was developed here. Partly Cleveland had grown very fast. It was growing very fast in 1900. It had been a couple of 100,000 people, and then it was over 1 million. And so in that situation, institutions had not built up gradually and then become ensconced. And I think that was a special opportunity in Cleveland. There might have been something like it in Detroit, but Detroit didn't take anything like the same pattern. There might have been something like it in Pittsburgh, but I think it has a much smaller Jewish community. So I think Cleveland is unusual. I've seen statements of where the Cleveland Jewish community sat internationally in the 20s. And I think, according to the Jewish Yearbook, you could probably say it was about the 20th largest in the world. Not the 5th largest or the 10th largest, but about the 20th largest. But comparatively, it was quite prosperous. And it was very well organized, and it was quite relatively well integrated. There were important banks that had been led by Jews in Cleveland in a pattern that I think is not so commonly, commercial banks, not so commonly shared in other places. I mean, there clearly were tensions over these kinds of things, but I think there was the community was more, my sense is, but there are probably people here that would know more about that than I do. That's my sense. Yes.
A couple of things. I noticed you made a distinction between Jewish philanthropy and Jewish institutions, which is very interesting because what we might that's just okay. But so my question is this: is that I think in your narrative you brought the story up only to about 1950 at the most. Most of your discourse had to do with the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So myself, who is very interested in social welfare, I'm a social worker. I worked for 40 years, and I stopped working because I didn't have to, because it's like a death sentence to be a social worker in this country. So at any rate, the question is this: is that to what extent has Jewish welfare been involved in social welfare up to the present, not to 1940, but up to the present? And also included in your, I'd also like you to address the fact that non-Jewish institutions fund Jewish institutions and the constraints that puts on the Jewish ethic and value of Jewish institutions.
Right. Terrific question, and it's one of the many large topics that I defined out of this because it's a matter of space and time. I can say a couple of things about that. I think the patterns I described more come up into the 1960s, and so so the big shift is the Great Society, which was a huge shift in the funding of all of these kinds of things. That starts 65 and 66, and what is the Great Society? Sometimes people think, well, it's the war on poverty, it's community action. The Great Society is Medicare and Medicaid. The Great Society is an expansion of Social Security to include a much larger part of the population, an expansion that continued under the Nixon administration. The Great Society is creating an endowment for humanities and an endowment for the arts, and then never funding them. The endowment for the humanities gets less money from the federal government than Case Western Reserve gets from the National Institutes of Health. I mean, it's not comparable. But there was a big expansion of the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, also during the Johnson administration. And so that that was a really big shift and created a new world. I mentioned Belfair. Belfair was a residential orphanage into the 1960s and somewhat beyond. And histories of social work leave the impression that that orphanages were closed in the 20s, but that's not true. They continued, and they were organized along religious affiliation lines. And as a consequence of that, if you had a large population that was unable to support its own institutions, there weren't orphanages. So African American kids ended up in county reformatories rather than because there were no orphanages for them. Elise Collin Hoggesfeld, who's another of my PhD students, is currently writing a history of orphanages, and it's really an extraordinary story, and it gets to this point about what happened after '65. In the case of childcare, there was federal money was available now, but there were federal standards, and so that meant whatever the connection, particular Disciples of Christ or a Jewish orphanage or a Catholic institution, the county got the money, and the county was told to place all the children without reference to religious affiliation. And the orphanages lost the ability to select children, which meant they couldn't serve their own communities, which meant the communities stopped supporting them. Now, on the other hand, that meant children who previously were being excluded because their communities didn't have any orphanages got better. So it's this painful trade-off, and then people didn't want to have orphanages anymore, and it's gone to foster care, with all the issues that obviously that's raised, especially because it's not adequately funded. So the story about what happens in the next is another very complicated story. And it's in many ways true that in the direct provision of service, all religious affiliated services, and the Jewish services were probably the best organized and the most professionally managed, have had to reinvent themselves, and their roles have been changed, and the roles have been limited. If you look at the federal funding of social services, it peaked in the Carter administration, and it was very significantly cut. And so in the 80s and 90s, many services that had been provided by social service organizations were redefined as medical conditions. And now you have an MD writing an order for service and a social worker providing a very specifically defined service, is the way I understand how things work in many of these areas now. And so there's a whole shift in the influence over the service that's provided, in the control of the people that provide the service, in the professions that dominate. So I think, does that fit with your understanding?
Yes, in my work experience, I worked for all public agencies and then Jewish agency.
Right.
And there's no difference whatsoever. And, I'm a little disappointed because I would like to see Jewish institutions reflecting the values and having more input into the salary, and the staff. I mean, like Jewish Family Services is like 70% non-Jewish, the staff, on all levels.
Right.
And there's nothing done to teach the non-Jewish staff anything about Jewish values. Occasionally there's a holiday, and then the staff takes the attitude, well, it's good to work at a Jewish place because then you get Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur off.
Right. Okay.
And there is no respect.
Right. This is part of a larger tension we have in the United States because we retained religious affiliation and religious communities as providers of so many services, healthcare and education, as well as welfare services, for so long. It's very different than in England or France. In France, they had a revolution, and they threw the Catholic Church out, and then they brought it back in, and they've negotiated over terms. And you can have religious communities for worship purposes, but the schools are state schools. There aren't any private universities or colleges to speak of. Some business schools, but not serious comprehensive universities in France. The same is really true in England. And England had the Church of England, which is a serious thing. There were Jewish legacies in the middle of the 19th century for support of Jewish education, and English courts said, well, that's not a thing in England, but Anglican education is, so we'll move the legacy to pay for Anglican education. At Oxford, I think there were 2 scholarships for Presbyterians in 1900. In the whole university. So they've made much more of a unified system. And so this is one of the indirect issues. I think one of the things that bedevils Hillary Clinton in critiquing a healthcare reform or educational reform that's to be uniform, that would be comprehensive, is how do you get comprehensive and not have that same kind of situation that you've described? Does that make sense?
Very fine.
An observation. You had a question in the back row.
So much of what you've referred to reflects the economic success of American Jewry from the 30s on. But taking it down to direct application, as I see it, the city of Cleveland's major decision makers, and I mean hospitals, museums, concert halls, etc., the governance is not reflective of Jewish participation. Now, the construction, the buildings are. So, in a sense, it seems to me that a compromise has been established and everybody plays the same game. And it is a game, in my judgment.
Right. I think you described accurately. I wonder if it isn't changing at the moment. It has changed in terms of who's been leadership. I know there have been Jewish chairs of key committees of the Cleveland Foundation, and there's clearly a whole shift in attitude at the art museum, and I think, and that's my impression, and I teach at Case Western Reserve, and the governance of Case Western Reserve, I'm just an employee. To me, it's mystifying. When?
I am a double graduate of that university, right. And the governance
right.
does not reflect particularly Jewish contribution. I don't mean money.
But there's that
governance,
too. Right.
Governance is what
Part of what I was highlighting here was a campaign from outside to gain influence, clearly, but also to change the nature of the institution, so the basis of what was previously exclusion would not be there anymore. And I think to a large extent that has been a very successful campaign. It took a long time, and it's regrettable that it had to be waged. On the other hand, it reflects the realities that were there. But I don't know that I don't know enough about the workings of the boards. That would really require that kind of information. Maybe others have some impressions on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you aware of any studies that have been made as to what would happen to contributions to religious organizations if the tax deduction were eliminated tomorrow, and the resulting increasing funds made available to the government would be used for comparable services?
There's a, through the Mandel Center, I've had a lot of conversations with people who study these things. It's not my direct area, but my understanding is that the tax policy has not a huge influence on how much people give. People give to what they care about, and I think there's a tendency in a lot of economic analysis of philanthropy not to recognize that people really care about some of the things that people have mentioned here, about the character of institutions, the quality of service, the commitment to representation or non-representation. This should represent what we would like to see from a lot of different points of view. So that there's the nonprofit world is full of organizations doing similar things but in a different spirit. And people, my brother sent his kids to the Little Red Schoolhouse in New York. There were a lot of other institutions with very distinctive cultural commitments he could have sent, schools he could have sent his kids to, but that's what he wanted to do. So I think those are important distinctions, and people care about those. And there was a lot of giving for these kinds of for the same kinds of purposes before the income tax. I'm not sure how big, but on the other hand, if you're an advocate for a charity, you would like to retain the tax exemption for donations. For very wealthy people, there's a limit to how much it is. If you're at the Romney level of wealth, there's actually a limit as to how much you can benefit. But I don't know how big that would be. Maybe I'll think of the other comment, but there's some other hands here.
I found the history of the foundation that you presented interesting, and it seems that the foundations provide services and not buildings. Maybe I'm mistaken, but it just seems if you look at Al Weatherhead, Bob Rissman, Albert Radner, any of the people with their names on the buildings around Cleveland, you wonder, unless they're doing it anonymously, are they not giving to the foundation but paying to build the building? I'm wondering why it isn't going through the foundations, because you never see a foundation being on the side of a building.
Right, lots of foundations say they don't go for, some foundations say specifically that they do. So foundations vary a lot, but many prefer not to give, and some of them will say they won't give for endowment. On the other hand, in the 50s, Ford Foundation started out by giving huge amounts of endowment to about 30 selected research universities. And then people said, well, what about this category of college or that category of college? And they made programs. And then what about dance? And what about orchestras? And they endowed a bunch of them. Or got them started. And they also then did educational programs, how to do fundraising and so forth. So they invested very much in the building up of endowments and also the acquisition of appropriate facilities.
What do you think these separate people that I just mentioned don't donate to the foundations, or maybe they do it anonymously, we don't know about, I don't know about it, but because they can't name where the money goes?
You can get a better tax benefit by giving directly for a new building at a university than by giving to a foundation. So if you have the scale of money that some people have, where you can give a major building to a major institution each year, you probably get a better tax benefit from giving $50 million at a time.
Yeah. I didn't mean the tax benefit though, I just meant that they can direct exactly what it's being used for. Like,
Well, you can do that also as a donor,
to a foundation.
To a donor who has the money in the bank, so to speak, in the markets, wherever it is, can talk to a university and say, we would like, Peter B. Lewis is well known, had very definite ideas about a building designed by Frank Gehry. And also definite ideas about how much of it he would pay for. And he went to the university, and I don't think they used a foundation for that.
I don't think so.
And so there's nothing preventing him from having an influence. So I was actually kind of eliding here. I wasn't only talking about foundations,
Okay.
but Beaumont was an interesting one which had a personal name on it and a limited time. And some of the others that I mentioned had that. but other people have given out of their investments. And in either way, an advantage of a foundation is if you want to influence something over time. One of my favorite examples here is the Case Endowment. When the two institutions were merged, a piece of the Case Endowment was held out, has its own board, and it decides each year where the income from that foundation will go. And it could compete with the university to add more money to its endowment. And that reflects the desire of the Case people to maintain a School of Applied Science ethos in a comprehensive university. And that with understandable concern that would be a distinct focus, and they want to make sure that's maintained. So if you want to maintain a particular kind of focus, then you would want to do that. Yeah.
What is your opinion regarding the relative shift over the last 20 some odd years from what I would affectionately call the eccentric millionaire model of we give because this is good, to the investment model of what do I get for my money?
I think that I really do think that distinction is overblown. I think my guess is if you went through the Beaumont Foundation's correspondence, you would find that there's a lot of buildings and a lot of facilities that they invested in, and many of them were all part of going concerns. And we can give you a building, what will you do with it to maintain it? Or we can give you some money to help maintain it, but what programs will there be? If it's Beaumont School, if it's the Beaumont building that used to be the Applied Social Sciences building at Reserve, what are you doing to be the leader in that field, and do I have confidence in that? And if you have money in your foundation, then while the foundation lasts, you can say, come back to us next year, show us what you've done, and maybe we'll fund something else. And so you keep us in your mind. If you move in another direction, that's fine. Then we still have the money to pursue the thing we care about. So influence, I think, has always been an issue. One of the famous early examples of giving that's essentially was a foundation, although he didn't set it up that way, Andrew Carnegie's libraries. He built 2,000 public libraries, paid for the buildings, but only if the local community enacted a permanent tax to yield income that would support the library. So eventually it was always going to need heating and cooling and staff, and they were going to have to buy books, and he wasn't endowing them for that. He was giving them an incentive. That's very active investment, right? To get and persuade, and if you didn't want to have a library, you didn't have to have one. If you wanted, and in part, he was successful by making it a thing that American communities have to have public libraries. And so then that was an intervention in a lot of ways. It was very active, very entrepreneurial, and very leverage focused, right? So those are the kinds of words that you hear today. I don't think that's new. I think the idea that people used to just write checks because is actually, you can say whatever you want to feel good this year or to raise money. I never have an objection to that. Fundraising is judged by the bottom line at the end of the campaign. But whether there's a real difference, one difference it does seem to me is that in education and healthcare, for example, the community chest raised perhaps 40% of the income of Cleveland hospitals in 1930. Obviously, they were much smaller, and they did many fewer things. Today, I think private giving in healthcare is about 2 or 3%. So the problem for a donor in healthcare is it's too big to have an influence. And so if I want to feel as though I'm making a real difference, I have to think in terms of leverage. I have to think in terms of being first and starting some new thing. So that's maybe a contrarian way of looking at it, and maybe I'm have a historian's bias that the past was better than we thought, and I don't think the past was particularly good, but I just think people did think in these kinds of terms. Let me just say one other thing. The business of intervening to encourage the idea that science can be secular and that universities don't have to be sectarian to be moral and effective and appropriate places to send young people to get ethical education, that was not easy. And that was very entrepreneurial and influence focused. And that was sustained over a long period of time. It was accomplished. And so now it doesn't, I mentioned the United Way. Keeping the community chest going meant that there was a stream of income that wasn't otherwise available. And then later people said foundations used to give to stupid, boring purposes like the community chest. Well, that's how it looked after the Great Society was created. And federal funding overwhelmed private funding in social service agencies. You couldn't turn the money down, but then there were all these other consequences. But on the other hand, in the past, you hadn't provided services for lots of people. So, yeah.
I had a question that pertained to historical side and one to current. From a historical perspective, not government funding, but private individual and foundation, is there any observable dynamic where the giver looks outside of taking care of one's own, so to speak? Is it a point where the ethnic or religious entity feels like they're assimilated or have made it, if you will, or something like that, and starting to look outside the group? Is there any observable dynamic or trend in America that you could point to? And my other question involving the current, does any archive or digest or register exist where philanthropists in Cleveland, apart from going to each individual organization and seeing who's on the donor list or anything like that, does any kind of comprehensive reference work exist that lists the donors and where they give?
To the second, I think the answer is mostly no. The biggest collection of material is at the Western Reserve Historical Society. It does have a Jewish archive and an archivist, and some very competent people have been there now for a dozen years or so, building the capacity in that direction. And so there's a lot of records there. And the Department of History at Case Western Reserve, with some Cleveland Foundation money and money from lots of other foundations, invested $2 or $3 million 15, 20 years ago in building the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History, which is online. And we actually created an endowed position for a graduate student to keep on working every year, adding topics that haven't been covered. So if you were interested in a list of people and they're not in the encyclopedia, send me the names and I'll see whether we can get some work done on them. I can't promise, but it could be a possibility. I don't know I know when we did the encyclopedia, there was a concern that all the histories of Cleveland celebrated the Yankee founders and omitted all the other communities. So there was an effort to fill in, excuse me. There was an effort to fill in those gaps. Your first question was?
About the idea of looking outside one's own, so to speak, and is there a tipping point from a historical perspective, something that's actually observable, or is it just a case-by-case kind of a situation? And I meant that not just from a religious, but from an ethnic or even political, well, political not so much, but...
One thing that has clearly been happening is that, on the one hand, ethnic groups are alive and well and vital in the United States. And on the other hand, there are people like me who married somebody from a different group, and then we have children, and and then you get a lot of dispersion as a result. And people are marrying into groups as well as marrying out. So, excuse me.
Sorry, I have a sugarless cough drop.
Oh, thank you. I've got one in my pocket, but it's very helpful. Maybe I've got it arrested. Oh, one more question over here.
Okay, sure.
I just want your comments on the fact that we have much more visibility in Cleveland of Jewish philanthropy. And that goes for this museum, and it goes through the temple that was restored at Case Western Reserve, and the marvelous arrangements that were made.
Right.
Now that is really spectacular and new, and how much of that kind of thing is going on elsewhere?
I think a certain amount is going on elsewhere. I think the involvement of the Jewish community and the larger community has a long and deep history. There certainly have always been tensions, and there have been questions about exclusion. I heard a ridiculous story about one major institution in Cleveland had decided that they would ask a Jewish person onto the board to make space on the board. They passed a new bylaw that you had to leave the board at age 70. They then went to this person, that created vacancies. They then went to this person and discovered that she was over 70. I mean, that's just gross incompetence. But there's a moment, you know, there have been changes of many kinds in that direction all over the country. I don't know that there. So I don't know the current story in Pittsburgh or Chicago or St. Louis or Minneapolis, St. Paul well enough. I don't have the impression that there is as prominent a set of examples. I think Boston may be a little more similar. I think LA is there's some very prominent Jewish donors to very large institutions now. A couple of people have moved huge fortunes from Pennsylvania or whatever to LA, partly maybe for the purpose of helping build up the institutional setting there and putting their names on some art museums and other buildings. So I think there's a variety of patterns, and obviously in LA there's been a prominent and not shy Jewish community for a long time. So I don't know all the. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, and at one point I know that the main performance hall took on the name of a family that was prominent in industry in Oregon. Had been for a long time, but the name hadn't been on any buildings, and there it was. But I don't know whether in Ashland, Oregon, there's any similar evidence. So, you know, I think it's hit and miss. Is my impression. It's an interesting question. I think the general question of expecting not to encounter hostility is. I mean, there's always concern, but I think there's maybe more confidence now, and one hopes that that's justified going forward. Right? That's maybe part of what you're asking. I don't know. Is that you had another question?
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot or anything. It's just that in something like this, with my background, I just have to ask a question. You don't have to answer it, or you know, you mentioned that the kernel of the growth of institution was that on the one hand you had a man who needed to go to school and he needed a scholarship. On the other hand, you had a philanthropist. So in between was the creation of the institution.
Right.
Now the question, in bringing it up to the present, is to what extent does the phenomenon of self-preservation of bureaucracies enter into the whole narrative that you've been mentioning?
Self-preservation of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
That's obviously always been an issue. I think you could. What?
How does it play into this?
Well, I think sometimes there needs to be critiques. Institutions and bureaucrats have a reputation, right? People want to be innovators and they want to be inspiring. They don't want to be pencil pushers. So it's an inherent problem. That's
So it is a problem.
I think I got to know a guy called Herbert Kaufman, who was at one point chair of political science at Yale, who wrote a very good book called The Forest Ranger. And he said, I asked him about the book, and he said, the Forest Service has a problem. They hire these guys, and they send them out to the woods 30 miles from anybody else. How do they know what they're doing out there? Right? And so they had to work on esprit de corps, they had to work on commitment to mission, they had to work on a variety of things. It couldn't just be formal reporting, it had to have some spirit to it. And so that was what he was at the height of the enthusiasm for learning about the science of public administration. He was one of the leading guys doing it, because he believed in public mission, and therefore you had to have bureaucrats, but they had to be inspired to really do the work that you wanted them to do. And so he was aware of, I think the default now is to assume that nobody's any damn good, and that they will just treat it as sinecure.
But, well, the default also is everybody trusts what's going on as though everything is peachy keen.
Well, I don't see a whole lot of that, but maybe that's because my wife was a school teacher, and
Well, all you have to do,
nobody believes teachers are doing anything right. So
well, when you go to the Federation's going to have a meeting April 12th, and they're going to ask 1,000 people to vote on their nominating committee and how well they're doing basically, and everybody in the room is going to say fine. There's not going to be one person except me who will vote against it. That's the way.
sometimes some of my friends on our faculty have a similar feeling, so, in a different context. Thank you. Thanks for the offer. That's very kind.